Hi there, my name's Ed Long. I'm the head of our US portfolio at Reuters Events Sustainable Business. It's a great pleasure to be joined by Gwen Migita, who's the Global Head of Social Impact, Equity and Sustainability at Caesars Entertainment. Today, we're going to be looking at advancing equity and inclusion through ESG investing. So firstly, I think a good place to start, Gwen, is on investor interest. What is the investor interest in diversity, equity and inclusion?
Sure. The interest has increased over the last several years. We've been tracking this for the last 9, and interest is primarily around workforce representation with visibility on advancements and hiring programs as well. And usually it's around gender, but seeing more activity around racial equity as well.
Have you seen this change over recent years?
Yeah, I would say a bit of a change. I mean, we're seeing more on, say, pay equity and a few assessors, a bit more on supplier diversity policies as expected by race, ethnicity, and spend, for example. And then when you look at your more common ESG metrics like culture, you're seeing a bit of a deeper dive on racial ethnic areas. Things such as climate, deforestation, etc. There is very much lacking a linkage when it comes to racial ethnic minorities. I mean, even things such as community involvement or involving indigenous populations. But there seems to be more of a refined approach in looking at explicit measures around race and ethnicity.
So on the front of ESG assessments today, so are racial equity included in that, and how are they included as well?
Yeah, so I'm looking at, for example, 5 of the most common assessors might say, workforce representation. What is a breakdown of workforce based on minority groups, age, nationality, disability? To what extent are these groups receiving general skills for promotion, advancement, and retention? I mean, even to the point of to what extent are they retained if one goes out on, say, paternity or maternity leave? There's also, of course, hiring, targeted recruitment. The more sophisticated ones might look at, how do you remove the biases when you look at hiring, retention, and promotion? There's many tools and strategies around that. And then, of course, company culture, right? I think in the U.S., some of the sayings say it's, you can't change the water in the fishbowl, but if you put a fish in a different type of fishbowl, whether or not they will thrive or survive or grow, that is really about the culture. So it might look like, to what extent do board policies reflect diversity by race and ethnicity? Or to what extent does one's human rights assessments and stakeholder assessments look at deeper explicit areas around it? It tends to lean more, again, towards gender, but again, it gets more refined over the years. And then, of course, supplier diversity. How does companies disclose the impacts on sourcing, where they source, how they source, whom is sourced from? Are they certified minority suppliers or disabled suppliers, veterans? There's about 7 classes that are operating in the U.S. by certified diverse suppliers that we look at. It may or may not be tied into the assessors, most likely not, and hoping to see how the advocacy NGO world as well as the assessor world connects over time. And that connection is not made at this point.
Okay. I think it's a really interesting debate as well, and so the data and the stats that are coming out are obviously showing that a more diverse workforce and a more inclusive workforce is a more productive, there's more R&D coming out of those companies, there's more patents coming out of those companies. So on that data perspective, what data is out there to support D&I issues and how D&I issues are material to the long-term performance of a business, and what should companies be looking for on that front?
Last year we looked pretty deep and wide at data or for data, and while many of these studies exist and it might be published like companies like McKinsey, who we use for our sort of change management and DEI work, there doesn't seem to be a natural acceptance by investor assessors on this type of data. In fact, there is some disconnect on language use or the doubt on the ROI of racial ethnic diversity. There may have been some greater acceptance around gender diversity, right? The more diverse workforces by gender or race, usually your threshold is about 1/3 of that pool by board, or 1/3 of that pool of C-suite will have that tipping point. We also see top performing companies and less performing companies also looking at data internally. The top third tend to have the most diverse leadership teams. The bottom third tend to have the least, and there tends to be a lot of correlations, and also some on causation as well on how this might occur. However, on the investor side, it is not feeding into language measures. It's more of a monitoring, like the early days of environmental sustainability, right? You either have a program or not. You have a policy, yes, no. Does it, performance is not, looked at, or proof of performance, or proof of the communication around remediation efforts, right? In early days, 15 years ago. That's kind of what we're seeing today with ESG and racial ethnic diversity.
Okay. So slight bit of a disconnect, I'd say. So how can companies promote that inclusion of diversity, equity? The metrics behind it for ESG assessment.
Yeah, I'm gonna show you something here. Last summer, based on a certain level of frustration and need to organize. Let me just show I am, able to share that we, Caesars Entertainment, identified partners that we could work with from our national diversity partners, and Biba Kalandra, who's really an expert in social ROI, or social impact. She worked at organizations like Georgetown University and ROI. So we hired her to do this assessment, or this white paper on, what are the considerations investors should make? What are the challenges that investors have in terms of searching for data? What are the barriers to investors in including this type of data for ESG? Also, what are the bright spots? Again, this was actually done data mostly last summer, 2019, before all of the pandemic and social justice issues occurred. So we're hoping to move this work forward with partners, if those who are interested, other companies. We worked with about 20 national diversity partners and 20 national corporate partners, or global corporate partners, many of them who might be part of this dialogue with this conference, and got their input on all of the pieces that you're asking about, and of course, what actions they might be interested in taking or working with us on. But independently, these are our conclusions, right? These are specific actions around research, standardization, right? Much like CDP and others have standardized carbon. Like, how do you standardize things and make it objective rather than subjective? Or, right, the NGO partners, many of them have their own assessments and grade companies on those assessments, but none of this is connected to the ESG side per se. Of course, voluntary disclosure by race, ethnicity, supply, spend, etc. Not just around workforce, not just around supply chain, which very few companies actually do, but there's other areas around policy, procedures, etc., and promotion and growth strategies that should be transparent, much like we said years ago, how much less bad are companies doing with environmental sustainability. It should pretty much be a standardized expectation, I think, of companies over time. And then, of course, actually what's not in here is the specifics around advocacy for companies, right? We don't talk about, say, unconscious bias or assumptions or misunderstanding of, the hundreds of countries or thousands of racial ethnic minorities and indigenous populations around the world. There's a lot of bias. It's not, unconscious bias is not bad. We just all have it. So what we tend to do is stay away from areas that are less comfortable and focus on what we can count. We can count women who identify as women, right? But we can't count very difficult situations, particularly the indigenous populations, and of course, Black Americans as well. There's a lot of biases there. I think that through training and advocacy with companies, this is where we see a lot of opportunity and movement. But how do you measure results, right? Our Latino partners, or we say Latinx partners around LULAC or Unidos in the US are seeing about a third of Latino Hispanic-owned companies close since the start of the pandemic, which is, HUSIR, Hispanic Corporate Responsibility Group, said Wilson sees, right, the growth of Latino Hispanics in America has exponentially extended in the last 20 years. But the portion of C-suite and board members that are Latino Hispanic are smaller. So how do you shift that narrative and look at, what, not a counting exercise, but truly advocacy and outcomes? And then, of course, you got advocacy for legislation there, which, of course, in many cases, it's much on a state basis, a voluntary, disclosure by companies like the Human Rights Campaign in the U.S. made a lot of progress around LGBT rights by expecting policy, process, procedure, and disclosing this, and incenting them to advocate on a state and federal basis. Right, in the last 20 years, the LGBT movement has come a significant way. How do you transfer that type of language and certain key issues that will get the most traction? Right, for example, marriage equality was not a significant priority for racial ethnic minorities if they were LGBT, but because it was a resonating point with the majority straight allies, that got a significant level of interest in legislative moves that many of these other things followed. So is there something like that on the racial ethnicity piece?
So I kind of, what you've been discussing to a certain degree comes back to the old argument of you can't manage what you don't measure, and we're so far front in terms of environmentally perspective, but even from social data and from a D&I perspective, we're so far behind in terms of reaching that kind of level of parity, and it is a lot more difficult to do, but it's definitely inroads that need to be made. We're on a tight time scale today, so we're nearly on our last question, and we're nearly at the end of our time. But I just wanted to ask, in terms of challenges that you've come across that might be found in the space in terms of promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion through ESG investing, rather. What kind of challenges have you been facing?
Yeah, I think it's interpreting what the benefit is. Right, often one might interpret it as a quota exercise rather than a business bottom line value exercise, right? Which is that, and oftentimes it's interpreted as just representation, right? By what you can see, relative to representation of, say, how does the hospitality industry, how does the customer experience change to be more differentiated, more dynamic, more, not just about inclusion, but it's about the revenue changes that you can have when it comes to external DEI work. And then, of course, what everyone seems to want, it's around how do you reduce, how do you even meet the UN SDGs, right? The poverty goals, right? It's very much around equity, inclusion, and a lot of what we say BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and the role also of corporate individuals, particularly municipalities and states in this day and age. It's a significant change than it might have been 15 years ago. And having conversations, there is a significant gap, I think, in I would say the under 40 generation, very much social media oriented, where we don't talk, we disagree, and we shoot pellets at each other over social media. I think there's also a digression in what humanity and civil discourse and authentic discussion and disagreement is, right? Compared to the earlier movements in the 60s and 70s, there was people who were on opposite sides, but they worked together for a solution. That's a significant difference. Yeah,
I think you could run a whole conference on the polarization that's going on discourse and the argument of how social media is having a play. Yeah, but our time's up, Gwen. So thank you so much for today. Thank you for discussing that. And yeah, great to have you on.
Sure. Thank you, Ed.